For today's shipwreck video, we return to an earlier time, both in the wreck itself and when it was discovered, because today we're looking at a wreck from all the way back in the Great War, and a wreck that was discovered in 2007, 17 years ago as of this upload. That makes Danton, the wreck in question, one of the earliest discoveries I've covered. This will have some impact on the quality of the images. Nonetheless, I find this an interesting wreck, both for the condition and for the story of the sinking. The French Navy, for better or worse, is pretty often overlooked, both in general and with shipwrecks as well. There are relatively few wrecks of note. Regardless, with Danton here, we'll follow the usual pattern. The ship and her sinking first, and then the wreck. Probably the first thing to note here, of course, is the uniquely French design of Danton, with 3 funnels behind the bridge, a large gap, and then 2 more at the stern. This was done because the turbines were housed amidships between the funnels, requiring 2 different boiler rooms for the amount of boilers the French wanted, or alternatively, the amount they needed. An interesting design choice to be certain, but then again, the French are always known for doing their own thing. Equally interesting in that regard are the turrets. As a Semi-Dreadnought, Danton had 2 different types, a pair of 12-inch turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern, and then no fewer than 6 wing turrets, each carrying 2 9.4-inch guns. This is relevant because part of the interest in this wreck comes from the turrets, or where the turrets used to be. That said, I'll do a full and proper breakdown on this ship at a later date. For now, the sinking. This came in 1917, specifically on March 19th of 1917. Danton had spent the Great War guarding convoys or keeping an eye on the Austro-Hungarians, to make sure their fleet didn't get any ideas of breaking out of the Adriatic. Not the most exciting of jobs, to be fair, but one that still wore the ship down. As a result, on March 19th, Danton was returning to duty after a refit in Toulon. Nothing particularly notable about this, as it was fairly routine work. Things would go wrong, however, southwest of Sardinia. The battleship was spotted by a German submarine, U-64. This boat spent her career in the Mediterranean and was actually quite successful, although this battleship would be far and away the greatest success. U-64 hit Danton with 2 torpedoes. This was fatal damage, and the battleship would ultimately sink in less than an hour. 806 survivors were pulled from the water, while U-64 evaded depth charging and made her escape. 296 men went down with the battleship, including the captain, who apparently stood on the bridge and made no attempt to evacuate. Considering the ship was carrying more men than usual, the relatively low death total is something of a miracle. She had been transporting crewmen for other ships at the time of the sinking. Regardless, Danton left the history books at this point. Her sinking was a tragedy, but it was, and arguably is, overlooked compared to Jutland, or even Gallipoli for that matter. In fact, from what I've read, her wreck being discovered at all was something of an accident. This wasn't like the petrol surveys in the Pacific, or the hunt for Bismarck or Roma. Danton was found in 2007 and surveyed in 2008 during an underwater survey, not for shipwrecks, but for a gas pipeline. This was evidently several kilometers from the reported sinking location, which isn't terribly surprising, as the ship likely drifted as she sank, and it's not uncommon for sinking locations to be slightly off in general. Either way, the wreck was found in more or less one piece, at a depth of 1,025 meters, or around 3,362 feet. Deep, certainly, but fairly shallow compared to really deep Pacific wrecks. That and the age of the ship has likely contributed to the rough condition, although part of it is also down to the sinking. such as the main battery turrets being missing, or the superstructure being a total mess. But that's enough background. Now let's look at the wreck. This will focus heavily on the sonar and a 3D model, as those are the best looks we have available. All I've found aside from those is grainy footage from the initial discovery, and 2 pictures of the wreck from a more recent 2015 survey. Luckily, the sonar and model are actually quite helpful, even if the model itself has apparently been taken down. I'll still link it, but it doesn't seem to be available. We do still have a couple stills, such as this one. As I said, probably the most distinctive bit is the missing turrets and the ruined superstructure. Both of the 12-inch turrets fell out during the sinking, as you can see here. That just leaves the barbettes empty of their weaponry. Interestingly, the bow barbette shows the roller bearings here. We can't see into the stern barbette, unfortunately. That said, we can see inside 2 of the wing barbettes, which seem to be full of debris, although details are sparse. As for the remaining turrets, those are in decent shape. 2 of the wing turrets are still trained out, with their barrels completely intact, although the one further forward is surrounded by the ruins of the bridge, and probably the forward funnels. The aft one is pretty clear, although the other aft turret is less pretty. From this angle, it seems to be missing a barrel, which would be a weird bit of damage considering Danton was torpedoed. However, as we'll see later, that's just a trick of the angle. The stern around it, on the other hand, is far worse. This is completely collapsed and crumpled in, with a very notable break here. Danton's bow is largely intact. Rusty, yes, but still upright and in one piece. Even the anchor chains are still visible. The stern, on the other hand, is completely totaled, although that damage seems to be concentrated on the port side. Considering the ship listed to port as she sank, seen here, that might be from the torpedoes. The hull was weakened in this area and collapsed, either when she hit the bottom or from the passage of time. That is, however, a guess. I haven't found any firm details in that regard. Beyond that, the only other details of this shot come from the superstructure and the casements. The latter you can see here, and we'll see them again later. As for the superstructure, most of that is missing. Only the conning tower is still intact, with everything else a pile of debris. The other still from the 3D model is from the starboard side, and from a lower angle. This serves to further demonstrate 2 things: how utterly ruined the superstructure is, of course, and how this side is in better shape on the stern. We can better see how the superstructure has collapsed here, not in detail, but in general wreckage. And below that, the stern hull is in one piece, not collapsed like on the port side, which is part of why I think the other damage is from the torpedoes. However, that's not to say there isn't damage to the starboard side. For example, you have most of the part above the waterline, which has completely fallen in. While the hull itself is in one piece, the same can't be said for the above water parts. This is clearly not from the torpedoes, so it's an open question what caused it. Perhaps a general weakening of the hull, but that's tough to say. And below that, the bottom is crumpled. That is almost certainly from water pressure. It's possible this part of the ship still had air pockets as she went down, as this does seem to be implosion damage. It even seems to follow compartment lines, as you can see what look like bulkheads between each crumpled section. Past that, there are 2 other things I want to note. First, the way the bridge structure has fallen over behind the conning tower. Some of that remains in place, tilted to the stern. And on the topic of tilted things, you also have the portside turret. That's wildly canted to the side. And you can also see the missing barrel here. Now for a quick look at the sonar. First, this shot, which is mostly notable for the debris field it shows to the stern. Unfortunately, it's too low resolution, to say much about what's in the debris field. I wouldn't be surprised if the missing turrets are there, but we can't be sure. The next one, for its part, is probably the most famous image of this ship, mostly because it's the one that gets spread around. It is, functionally, the same as the 3D model, a good look at the positions of the turrets and the ruined superstructure. Unfortunately, without enough detail to say much else, other than the apparent crater towards the stern, which might lend credence to the torpedo-weakened hull collapsed on impact idea. The final two sonar shots, meanwhile, are mostly notable for how unique they are. You don't normally see sonar presented in this black and white style. It gives a good look at the conning tower and turrets here, and the second one shows the same, but for the stern turrets, including the empty barbette, and the mismatched barrels here. Either way, we've reached the end of the sonar, and almost to the end of the video for that matter. There's only a handful of pictures of the wreck, and only two that I'd call good quality. I'll save those two for last. First, a couple shots from the dive video, which I'll link in the description. First, we have the bow, which is actually in decent shape, as we saw on the model. Certainly rusty and covered in silt. But, considering how long the ship has been on the bottom, it's actually not bad. Reminds me a bit of Roma's condition, despite the 26-year gap between their sinkings. Unfortunately, the next images are much rougher on the quality. First, a bit further out from the bow. The notable thing here is the lower view. Much like Titanic, Danton's bow rises from the darkness, still sharp and still pointing ahead. The rusticles are also more apparent, but the bow is still in one piece. And so were, for that matter, the anchor chains. These are still resting on the deck, although covered in silt. And, for that matter, the crumbly pattern of rust. Those do look like they've been underwater for a century, as you could expect. Although I can't say much else here, because the structure behind them is too dark to make out. On the other hand, moving further back, we do actually get a look at that barbette. The video quality leaves much to be desired, so the details are hard to make out. I don't blame it for that, since this is from 2008, but it's worth noting. Poor quality or not, we still don't see inside barbettes like this very often. That said, I think the most striking thing is definitely the size. Perspective is everything, of course, but this is a very small barbette for a twin 12-inch gun turret, which is a good point to move on to the other weapons. First, a pair of the casement guns. On Danton, these were 3-inch, 75mm weapons. Well, 2.9 inches technically. Here we can see two of those still in their position. These are, much like the anchor chains, very heavily corroded, something that's more apparent from closer in. This does demonstrate the age of the wreck pretty well. Unfortunately, we don't have a good look at the larger weaponry, just a brief glimpse at two of the 9.4-inch barrels, which are, more or less, the same as the casement guns, rusted out, covered in silt, and poking out from their turret, which is just out of frame in this image. Although we do get a good look inside one of the barrels, which is full of silt. No visible rifling here. Which leaves us with one picture from that video. A porthole surrounded by rusted out metal, mostly notable for being an intact porthole, and for a good look inside the ship, although all we can see is some apparent debris. And now we can look at the higher quality pictures. First, another look at casements. These seem rougher, but I'm not sure if they're the same ones or on the other side. Regardless, one barrel has fallen down, and the hull is rusting out around them. In fact, the hull is heavily rusted in general. Not surprising, but worth noting. What is surprising are the intact portholes, especially on the superstructure higher up, and the ladder, which is corroded but still fixed in place. I'm honestly amazed that is still there. The superstructure, though, is broken, as could be expected from the model earlier, but seeing it in person is another thing entirely. There's very little left. Also barely visible here, one of the empty barbettes, which means this is on the port side. And with that, we come to the final picture, a side shot from somewhere further back. We have more casements here, along with a couple portholes. The most notable things, however, are the hole here and the bulged out hull. The condition isn't great here, to say the least, even though we do get another look inside the ship thanks to the open casement. Unfortunately, much like the other pictures, there's not much detail to speak of. So with that, we've come to the end of the video. Danton is an interesting wreck to be sure, though I hope more pictures from that survey pop up. If anyone has any, by all means link it in the comments. I'd be happy to do a follow-up video. For now though, Danton remains, rusting away and largely forgotten after a century beneath the waves. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.